Welcome to Grow Her Wings, a podcast by the Malou Project, a 501c3 based in Jacksonville, Florida, with a mission to connect girls to aviation. We are your hosts, Jen and Carrie, and we invite you to join us as we meet new people, talk to old friends, and learn new lessons on the path to inspire more of us to grow our wings.
Good morning. Happy Saturday.
Good morning, Colonel Opke. Someone
Yes,
got
ma'am.
yesterday. Congratulations, that's huge.
Just had to throw that in there. Like we just spent 10, 15 minutes prepping for this.
I had to because, and I like that I just got to throw it out there and you got to have that natural reaction to it. This is awesome. This is huge.
And Jess was out with us last night.
I was. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Me as well. It was amazing.
I'm sorry I missed the fun, but I can't hear out of my right ear right now.
Yeah. Ear infections are a thing.
They're apparently my thing.
Yeah. So this morning we've got Jess Ruttenber on, an amazing woman that reached out to me because I am the secretary of the Women's Military Aviators, WMA. And she's trying to affect some incredible change incrementally and without taking too much away from how she wants to share what she's doing. Jess, can you just give us a short intro of what you're doing now, and then we'll get into kind of like who you are and where you're at and how you got into what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So I'm an Air Force pilot and I work on the staff in the Pentagon, and I volunteer on a group called the Women's Initiative Team, the WIT. The WIT is a barrier analysis working group. We've been around since 2008, and we have other barrier working groups, but the WIT is the most active. And we analyze barriers for civilian women, military women to succeed in the military and the Air Force. We try to affect change through policy so we can increase the number of women in service. So I'm working on a few projects. Women's issues aren't just aviation related, but I focus a lot on women in aviation, as well as family planning, pregnancy, those issues that impact families in the service.
I didn't know that it was around since 2008. Did you know that, Carrie?
Because I finally remember really reading about it my last 2 years before I retired, thinking, oh, it's great that they're starting something like this. 2008, I was in North Carolina.
Yeah, I think the
5 PCSs before I retired.
Social media has really connected us in a new way that we could take, all our supporters, men and women, that, and we could, connect easier instead of, just having 5 women in the Pentagon working on a project. So now we've hundreds, and our Facebook group is, I think, approaching 2,000. So we have, amazing people on there every day. What's your
Facebook group?
So you can go and join the Women's Initiative Team on Facebook. It's an Air Force site. So, they'll ask you 3 questions. Just basically, how are you connected to the military? What's your DoD account if you're a civilian or military member? To email, and you can just join the group.
Yeah. And I know you all talk about some really interesting, fascinating things. And I love some of the policy changes. Pretty genius, to be honest.
Yeah, I'll have to say, I feel a little bit like I'm meeting a celebrity that I met on Facebook, because I've been reading some of the things that you've written, Jess, from the Women Mentorship Forum, Officers. I've stayed in that past retirement and then moved over to the retired or retiring to offer some advice to people as they're going. But I've been reading, like, oh, I've read Jess's stuff. So this is like I'm meeting a little bit of a celebrity here today. So thank you for a lot of the stuff that you've helped not only influence, but actually push out so that we can see it's happening. I think that's a part that's missing sometimes.
Yeah, the last 2 years, I think, I was hiding under a rock, and then I said, we need to talk about this more. And I think a lot of the women, we need to have social media presence. We just got approved for an Instagram page and a Twitter, so we can keep up with the times instead of, DoD email, right? And connect better. Writing articles, because my story, I just tell it to another, women in my career field as I meet them, and my husband was like, we should really just put it out there. It's scary, but I'm really glad I did it. And I think everybody should tell their story.
Yeah.
Speaking of your story, can you give us some of your background and how you got into aviation?
Right. Growing up, I was born in DC, but when I was in elementary school, we moved down to Pensacola for a few years. And I was always that kid that was playing in the woods, and I would organize all the kids into armies, and I would assign them ranks, and I put myself in charge. And I was just really drawn to the military. I'm gonna date myself. So this is like the 80s, right? We're approaching the 90s. Women aren't fighter pilots yet. So I haven't made that connection. But there's the Blue Angels down in Pensacola. And if you ever have the opportunity to live there, they not only do an air show every year on the beach, but they practice all the time. So you could see these jets above you. And my mom would drag me to the Naval Aviation Museum. And so it really was, I was drawn to it. And then one day, I think it was in middle school, on a career day for girls, a female pilot came, and I don't even know what she flew, but just based on the time, she was probably a heavy pilot based on, she couldn't fly fighters. I just said in my mind, I'm like, that's an option. Like, I'd never seen a female pilot. And I just went from there to college and Air Force ROTC, and I commissioned, and I couldn't meet the standards for my vision. I had eyes that were not meeting the depth perception. So I commissioned as a cyber officer, which is a comm officer back then, 33S. And I was persistent. I mean, I stalked the optometrist. Like, there has got to be a way that I could pass the depth perception test. And, it ends up, I could fix my eyes, and I did. And I worked really, really hard as a lieutenant. I mean, every dollar I had went into flying civil aircraft to get a commercial pilot, private pilot's license. Because I was meeting, you get higher score to try to transfer to be a pilot by how many flying hours you have. And you could test in certain things and get higher scores, and you get this final score, and that score goes to the board for your consideration. So effectively, you can pay your way to some of the score, which is unfortunate in some of the barriers that we have today. But so every day after work, I would go over to the flying club, and I would get hours, and I would just do whatever it took. And just before I pinned on captain, I went on a deployment, I packaged up my application to become a pilot, and I got accepted. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was like, dream come true. And then fast forward, I go to pilot training in Columbus, Mississippi. But on the way, I stopped. I love.
I think we all went to Columbus.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. There is some talk about food in the South later.
Yes.
Yeah. So I show up at Columbus, but on the way I had to do another flight screening in Texas. You one last check and everything. And I didn't know at the time, but I failed my height check. I was kind of like, and my toe was like this the last time they measured me, because you have to be 5'4". And I thought I was fine. No one said anything. So I'm sitting there for a couple of weeks in pilot training, first day of class. Everyone stands up. We want to be so excited watching the jets above me in the day, and I'm pulled out of my class.
Oh, no.
2 hours in, and I told the medical class and I would not be a pilot, and I was just devastated.
Yeah.
I ended up finding a way, because I'm pretty persistent when I want something, to find a path to wings. And they were currently developing a height waiver. Possibly I could apply for an exception policy. So I literally was given a month off I just drove around the country, and I went to Charleston, and I sat in the C-17, and they measured me in a C-17. And then I drove to Little Rock, and I sat in a C-130, and they measured me in a C-130. And then I drove to Meridian, Mississippi, and I sat in a 135. I just went around the country on like my own tour. And then tried to find an aircraft I could fly. And that was the KC-135. And so I got an exception policy, and I was returned to flying, and I finished pilot training. I went out to my first duty station as a 135 pilot. And fast forward you know, I'm a major, I'm a lieutenant colonel, and this was still happening to a lot of women. It impacts men too, right? But it's just, so it only impacts 3.7% of women, but the height standards for aviation in the Air Force, former standards, was 5'4" to 6'5". And that impacted almost half the female population in the United States. So it really was an engineering barrier in the aircraft that was preventing women from becoming even navigators, not just pilots, right? So, and for you listening ladies, there's lots of career fields out there as well. You know, you could be a loadmaster, a boom operator, a flight attendant, a linguist. There's so many opportunities out there. But I was like, enough, right? We've got to fix this. The Air Force, you know, this was designed before women were in combat, right? So they're not doing it intentionally. And the Air Force absolutely wants to fix this problem. There's certain data that they were missing in their analysis. And what they were doing was just kind of putting a waiver in process, but not really understanding the overall root cause of it, which is a 1967 anthropometric survey that used all Caucasian men to design everything. So not only does it affect women, it impacts minorities, right? So there's also a sitting height standard, which I also failed. And that, because different types of ethnicity have different types of build, right? Some of us have longer torsos, shorter legs, vice versa, for the average person of a certain ethnicity. So 74% of Black women cannot pass the sitting height.
Wow.
72% of cannot pass the sitting height. So yeah, and it's all over the place. It's in the medical community, these standards are in engineers and contracts. So I pulled together a team and came up with a strategy. Amazing people that volunteered on there. Andrea Harrington, Chief Chris Dawson in the Air National Guard is like killing it for the enlisted side. Jennifer Whitestone at the Anthropometrics Lab in Wright Pat. I could go on and on, right? And we started pulling contracts and for the F-35 and the T-6 and started reading nonstop and came up with a path forward and pitched it to the Air Force, specifically Dr. Roper at Acquisitions. He 100% supported us, changed the policy to make sure that everything we design from here on out, aircraft and flight equipment like G-suits, vests, helmet, now has to meet 95% of the recruiting population. So now got to be designed for women in mind and minorities.
That's awesome. I mean, that's a lot to cover right there.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's huge.
Dry mouth. I'm gonna drink a bunch of water here. Sorry, I'm getting a little nervous.
I just know that this is one of those, when you brought up the height thing, it got me flashbacks to being a junior, my junior year at the Air Force Academy, staying in bed and hanging upside down for bullet bars all day Sunday. And my classmates carried me down Monday morning on a stretcher, and one of those makeshift green stretchers, and had already set it up because I was being such a pain to the staff down at the cadet clinic for all of my, because I was just trying to get into flight screening. I was trying to get into the T3. And they carried me down. The first thing they measured my height, and I was 5'4.5". Only day in my life. I'm 5'3".
I'm so sorry.
But that was the only thing, because the sitting height was so close. So I was able to, like, you know, sit up a little bit taller, you know, flex a little bit and get myself that last quarter of an inch that I was missing there. But I think about that of, if not for awesome classmates and an awesome flight surgeon that was like, okay, as soon as you get here, we're measuring your height, because by the end of your physical, you're going to be short again. And getting that written there.
Like, that's the thing, right? Like, and
you need.
Yeah, you hit on it, Jess. And there's an article that was written, and I meant to have it available for this, but an Army major wrote an article about how, you know, the military was built based on men, but what if it was built for women, right? Like, if it was originally all women, what problems would we have integrating men, right? It wasn't deliberate that they left us out. It's just what it is, because that was what was. And
now we need to change it for what it now is, and that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
hidden barrier. No one's intentionally doing this. It took a long time to get after the root cause. And we were kind of like people, honestly, the senior leaders were trying to fix this as they could, best they could. Some of the things that were preventing us from figuring out the root cause was that there is a pretty successful waiver process, but it's hard to measure how many women self-eliminated by Googling, hey, how tall do I have to be a pilot? It just didn't apply, right? Because we had a study done by a major, an ACSC that studied cadets to prove that they're less likely to apply if they don't think they meet the qualification. So when we say there's a waiver, that's the waivers barrier. The second thing is the waiver process, 90% are approved, and that's amazing. That is progress. That was a great stopgap for a problem that we've had for decades. But why are we still using this waiver process in 2020, right? It was stopgaps are temporary, right? Because we're not going to redesign an aircraft that was designed in the 70s, right? We just physically can't do that with limited resources. But it masked a problem when senior leaders saw that statistic. And what you saw was 90% success rate, but you're only going to fly like 2 aircraft, right? The F-15 only accommodates 8.9% of women, right? So you're going to get a waiver, but you're going to be limited on what you fly. And that's why we have to the aircraft that we're designing now. So we fast forward to the 90s and 2000s when women were flying in combat. And what we discovered was the Air Force is moving in the right direction to improve the accommodation for women, but they were still eliminating a large portion. So if you look up the F-35, it's a success story, right? 97% accommodating to women and men. It's amazing. We fixed the problem. We didn't really fix the problem. If you look at the anthropometric data, originally it only accommodated about 55% of women. And acquisitions leaders came along and said, oh, that's no good. Let's make it 80%. So they were still okay with it, not accommodating 20% of women, but almost all of men. And it was Congress getting involved that mandated it or to become higher than that. So if we take the same data from previously, right, we could accidentally design an aircraft using the 80%. We don't have to talk about it, but that was what was going on. And so we weren't really doing it ourselves without knowing it. We just assumed, hey, the F-35 is good to go, so we probably fixed this problem already. But really, there was little things because we use that same database to design uniforms and flight equipment. And so they're designing aircraft G suits only to 5'4" and higher, which they're fixing right now as well. Like they're fixing everything. The Air Force is killing it. But that was the real hidden barrier.
That's amazing. Yeah, to just key in on those kind of things and knowing that, it's unintentional bias, right? It's unconscious bias. They don't even recognize what they're doing. And I don't know what will happen as we go forward. If it'll up, I'm hoping 100%. But there's the balance of cost versus reward, I think. And I don't know, maybe we just accommodate 80% of men and make up for.
But what this gives me hope as a retired lady who saw some of those barriers, trying to figure out how to get around them, knowing that you guys are out there serving, the teams you're serving with are finding these root causes instead of just continuing to Band-Aid, because sometimes barriers are there because we didn't notice they were there, or what they were actually influencing. Like you said, Jess, we don't really know how many people self-eliminated because they saw the standard.
Right. So now,
how many more of those are yet to be uncovered?
So if you want to apply to become a pilot or an enlisted aviator, so the enlisted don't actually have a waiver process. When they first designed the waiver, they only measured the cockpit positions and not some of the crew stations for the enlisted. So Chief Dawson is currently working with the Jennifer Whitestone and her team, and they're going around now remeasuring all the Air Force aircraft to create the same database that the female pilots have. You can now apply. And when you bring up costs, right? So when we think about diversity, sometimes we think, oh, they're lowering our standards so we can get more women in, right? But we really need to do this because we're losing money. Like crypto linguists, they're enlisted position. They fly RC-135, MC-12s, that kind of thing. Their skill set is essential to the national defense strategy. I mean, just to learn any kind of dialect for Chinese, Mandarin, that kind of thing, we weren't being able to recruit enough people in that career field, right? So they were severely undermanned, and what they had to do is lower the standard for the academic test to become a linguist, so they can get enough linguists in. And by doing so, they had a really high washout rate or retraining, and it cost a lot of money to do that. But there was tons of 5'2" women that could speak it fluent and couldn't get a height waiver, right? So, and it only cost $125,000, right, to measure that one aircraft and create a waiver for that position. They literally just have to sit in the back of an aircraft, right? So we're losing money by not having a more diverse group of candidates to get after, right? So we're in a talent competition because 71% of America's youth is not eligible to apply to the military because of academic aptitudes, medical reasons. So our recruiting population is actually getting smaller, and China, 15 times the STEM graduates as the United States by 2030 is estimated. They are also going to have 4 times the population of us and twice the GDP. So they have more money, more people, and smarter people, and our pool is getting smaller. So we have to include minorities and women in our talent pool to stay relevant.
I love it. I love it. Absolutely. And it's not just like it's not a gender capability thing. It's literally a national security issue.
Right. Yeah.
It's good.
I'm glad you guys are doing great things. It warms my heart.
So one other thing that you had keyed on, Jess, early on was just persistence. And, Claudia talked about it in our podcast, she knew that she wanted to fly, period. And just like you said, you stalked the optometrist, that is what it takes sometimes, is just you knowing what you want to do and not ever letting anyone else define it for you. Right? And that can be applied to anybody. But I think that sometimes in our culture or whatever, we teach our children, boys, girls, minorities, whatever, that somebody else is defining for them what their opportunities are because of who they are. Mm-hmm. And that's really important. And a message that I think we need to keep sending out is that, look, I did it because I was persistent. And I was doggedly committed to my vision. So don't ever let anybody else tell you can't do it, because we've got people like you who are out there trying to identify where those hidden barriers are so that they can.
Right. Don't walk by problems, right? And admire them. Do something about just one thing, whether it impacts you or somebody that you're in charge of. Just fix one thing, right? And get after it.
Yeah.
I think that's the other part. It doesn't necessarily have to impact you. It could be somebody that you're talking to or mentoring. There's that too, that persistence. Like the three of us, I mean, we knew what we want to do and we're going to pursue it. There are some people who they still want it just as badly as us, but due to maybe certain things that they've had in their backgrounds, in their society, their environment, they start to want to, but the noise is just too great to get through. And I think that's the other opportunity we have, is to help them recognize that you may not be the most vocal, but you can be. And here, I'm going to help you by showing you this path. So there's the recognizing your own persistence and then seeing how you can use your own persistence to help someone that might need you to lead them down the path a little bit. So I think there's an important role in that part too, because I knew what I wanted to be, but I was on the shyer end. So it took a little bit of nudging of someone to remind me of, hey, you've told me a few times you really wanted to do this, or I could have ended up a statistic. So I knew what I wanted to be, and I wanted to doggedly pursue it, but I was a little less consistent in my pursuit. So I would also say that for people out there that would hear this and they've seen them want to pursue it, because too often I think we dismiss, if they want it bad enough, they're going to fight for it. If they want it bad enough, they will fight for it, but we can't just assume that they don't want it because they start to give up, because those barriers are strong. And some of those, and sometimes the thing they have to overcome is greater than what we may have had to push through to overcome. So I think it's important to keep that in mind too, of reach in, find those people, help them, show them the right path, mentor them along it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What you guys are doing on this podcast is amazing, to inspire people to come to aviation that may not have thought it was possible, because representation matters, right? If you don't see like your mind doesn't make that connection that it's a possibility for your future.
Yeah. And Jess, you have a blog, right? What's the name of your blog?
It's hidden-barriers.org. I had to do the dash because somebody already owned.
Nice.
I really like the name because, no one's doing these things intentionally. If they're second and third order, there really are hidden barriers.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jess. This has been an amazing conversation.
Yeah, it has been. Thank you for having me.
And we've got the blog for you, and we'll share some links that you wanted us to kind of share with the academy, the Flight Academy. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Right. So for any use out there, if you're looking for, free flying hours, because flying is expensive, there's some opportunities that there's some programs out there that you could apply for to get free flight lessons.
Yep. So we'll include that link. And then, Carrie, do you have anything else you want to talk about before we start wrapping up?
No, I just wanted to say thanks. It was great to finally meet you, Jess. I've been reading what you've been putting out, both on your blog and on some of the Facebook forums. So I appreciate what you're doing and the message that you're putting out and taking the time to talk with us today.
Yeah, and if you guys enjoy our podcast and want to support us, please hit that subscribe button. Oh man, I sound like a podcaster.
No, share it with your friends. Even if this is content that may not necessarily apply to you, but somebody that could benefit from learning about this, hit subscribe, share.
Yeah, put it on your Facebook. Use that social media like we talked about with the WIT team.